The record was warped. That was the first thing Kalen noticed. The Draymari Minister of Signal Integrity stared at the object his security chief had placed on his desk, his crystalline facets catching the chamber's blue emergency lighting in ways that made him look fractured. It was black. It was round. It was grotesquely, deliberately imperfect, its surface scored with concentric ridges that spiraled inward like a wound. Kalen had seen human artifacts before, of course. He had ordered enough of them destroyed. But this one sat on his private console, vibrating faintly against the polished obsidian, and it was emitting sound. Not through the station speakers. Not through the broadcast grid he controlled. Through his own personal frequency, encrypted, shielded, supposedly inviolate. A single piano note emerged. Then another. The spacing between them felt wrong to his precision-tuned auditory sensors, as if the performer were pausing to remember why they were alive. Kalen reached to crush the object, but his hand stopped. The music was not loud. It was not aggressive. It was simply present, occupying space he had designated as exclusively his, and there was something in the spaces between the notes that made his stillness feel like a response. He stood motionless for 9 seconds. Then he touched his console. The music continued. His encryption team would be executed by morning. 9 years earlier, the hardest decision Yuki Tanaka faced was which tea to serve at the preliminary hearing. She had stood in the observation deck's kitchenette, holding 2 canisters, while through the reinforced glass the council chamber rotated slowly against the starfield. The green tea was ceremonial, respectful, a gesture of cultural presentation. The black tea was practical, caffeinated, the kind you drank when preparing for war. Yuki chose the black tea. She did not know she was choosing war. She only knew that the Draymari delegation had arrived 17 minutes early, that their crystalline faces reflected light in ways that made them impossible to read, and that her hands were shaking slightly as she set the kettle to boil. She knitted while she waited. Small, precise motions. A geometric pattern she had learned from her grandmother, though she had modified it over the years, adding rows, subtracting others, until the shape no longer resembled anything her grandmother would recognize. The needles clicked against each other in a rhythm that steadied her breathing. She did not look at the pattern. She did not need to. Her fingers knew it the way her lungs knew air. Julian Thorne found her there, still knitting, when the hearing's conclusion echoed through the station's public address system. "They did it," he said. He was 31, built like someone who had grown up in gravity heavier than Earth's, and his voice carried the particular roughness of a man who had spent the morning shouting at people who refused to listen. The vote passed. We're silenced. No broadcast rights, no cultural transmission, no signal of any kind beyond basic diplomatic frequencies. We're invisible. Yuki's needles did not stop. Click. 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 Did you expect otherwise? I expected a fight. Julian slammed his palm against the wall, a gesture that had become habitual in the 3 months since his assignment to the diplomatic corps. I expected us to stand up and say no. I expected something loud. Loud gets noticed. Yuki set down her knitting. The geometric pattern was roughly the size of her palm, dense with interlocking angles. She tucked it into her jacket pocket without looking at it. Loud gets crushed. We're not going to be loud, Julian. Then what are we going to be? Yuki crossed to the window. Below, the council station turned slowly, a wheel of light and shadow where species she had spent her adult life trying to understand would now pretend humanity no longer existed. She thought of the black tea, cooling now in the pot she had abandoned. She thought of her grandmother's hands, showing her the basic stitch when she was 6 years old, saying the pattern holds even when you can't see it yet. We're going to be patient, she said. And we're going to be everywhere they aren't looking. She did not tell him about the record. She did not tell him about the operatives already embedded, the archive already built, the frequency already chosen. She did not tell him that she had been preparing for this moment since before she accepted the linguistics posting, since before she learned to speak Palori or read Draymari crystalline script. She only told him what he needed to hear to become useful. "Find me Elias," she said. "The archive clerk in Berlin. Tell him the preliminary phase is over. Tell him we need the inventory by Thursday." Julian stared at her. "What inventory?" Yuki smiled. It was not a warm expression. It was the smile of someone who had been waiting for a door to close so she could finally open the one behind it. The inventory of everything they tried to bury. The operation had no official name for its first 3 years. Yuki called it her knitting project when she referenced it in encrypted messages, a joke that only she found funny. By year 4, the 12 operatives embedded across the Council's media infrastructure had begun calling it resonance, though they never spoke the word aloud. By year 5, Nadia in Cairo had discovered something that changed everything. She had gone undercover among the Draymari lower class, a population of crystalline laborers who lived in the shadow of their own aristocracy, their facets dulled by industrial particulate, their voices rarely heard in council chambers. Her cover was simple, a trader of human contraband, selling what the edict had forbidden. She expected fear. She expected secrecy. She did not expect the hunger. They bought everything. Not just the popular entertainment, the violent spectacles, the sentimental dramas. They bought human poetry. Human mathematics lectures. Human cooking shows. A Draymari factory worker named Voss had traded 3 weeks' wages for a recording of a human child learning to play violin, the screeching initial notes preserved in their original, unedited form. When Nadia asked why, Voss had turned his dulled facets toward her and said something she reported back to Yuki with shaking hands. "We can hear the trying," Voss said. "In our culture, imperfection is edited before transmission. But here, we can hear the trying. It sounds like permission to exist." Nadia expanded her network. She found that Draymari teenagers were composing their own music using stolen human instruments, that Draymari parents were teaching their children English from banned phrasebooks, that a black market of human cultural artifacts had become the primary economy of the lower districts. The Draymari aristocracy, she reported, had no idea. Or if they had an idea, they did not understand the scale. Yuki received this report in her quarters on the observation deck, where she had lived for 5 years in a room just large enough for a bed, a desk, and her record player. She read Nadia's encrypted file 3 times. Then she placed the needle on her vinyl copy of Glenn Gould's 1955 Goldberg Variations, a recording she had brought from Earth against all regulations, its surface already worn from years of play. The music filled her small room. The imperfections were there, audible even to her human ears. The slight scratch of the needle. The barely perceptible warp that made certain notes wobble. The ambient noise of the recording studio, footsteps, breathing, the creak of a piano bench. Gould had recorded it in a single session, refusing edits, refusing perfection. Yuki had chosen this specific pressing because of its flaws, not despite them. She understood something then that she had only intuited before. In a galaxy where every transmission was digitally perfected, where every cultural product was scrubbed of error before reaching its audience, imperfection was not a weakness. It was evidence. Proof that something had been made by hands, by breath, by choice rather than committee. The Draymari lower class was not consuming human culture because it was better than their own. They were consuming it because the flaws proved it was real. She began knitting a new pattern that night. Not her grandmother's design. Something else. She listened to the opening aria, her fingers moving in time with the rhythm, and she translated what she heard into geometry. A peak became a knit stitch. A valley became a pearl. The microgroove deviations, the surface imperfections that carried the steganographic key, she encoded into the tension of her yarn. She did not write any of this down. She did not photograph the pattern. She committed it to muscle memory, the way a musician commits a score to their hands, the way a soldier commits a weapon's weight to their shoulder. If they ever took her data pads, her files, her equipment, they would find nothing. A woman who knitted to calm her nerves. A hobby. A nervous habit. Thessari found her in the garden. The Palori diplomat was 80 years old by human reckoning, though her avian features made age difficult to estimate. Her feathers had shifted from the bright plumage of youth to muted grays and browns, the colors of someone who had learned that survival often required invisibility. She moved through the station's hydroponic garden with a gait that suggested permanent injury, one wing held slightly askew from an accident never discussed. Yuki had seen her at council functions, always at the periphery, always watching. "You are not the first species they have done this to," Thessari said. She did not look at Yuki. She was feeding seeds to a small plant that Yuki did not recognize, her clawed fingers moving with practiced gentleness. "The Palori were silenced 40 years ago. Before your species arrived. The Kalari before us. There is a list." Yuki's needles stopped. She had learned enough Palori etiquette to know that direct eye contact during a political conversation was considered predatory. She kept her gaze on her knitting. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you are knitting the Goldberg variations." Thessari turned her head, one large eye focusing on Yuki with disconcerting precision. "I recognize the waveform. My species hears in patterns you cannot imagine. The tension changes in your third row correspond to the microgroove deviations in the 1955 Columbia recording. You are not calming your nerves, Dr. Tanaka. You are encoding a cryptographic key into muscle memory." The garden's ventilation system hummed. Somewhere, water dripped into a reservoir. Yuki felt the familiar coldness that preceded her best decisions, the particular clarity that arrived when a secret became shared. "How long have you known?" "Since the preliminary hearing." Thessari produced a physical paper note from beneath her wing, a deliberate anachronism in a digital age. She slipped it into Yuki's data pad, the contrast between ancient and modern so absurd that it felt like a gesture of trust. The Council's media monopoly is not invulnerable. It has weak points. Vulnerable members. Species who remember what it meant to be heard. I have made a list. Yuki unfolded the note. Names. Species. Contact methods. All written in a handwriting that suggested haste and care in equal measure. She read them once, committed them to memory, and tucked the note into her pocket beside her knitting. "What do you want?" she asked. Thessari's feathers rippled, the Palori equivalent of a shrug. "When the music plays, make sure we can hear it. We have been waiting 40 years for someone to remember the frequency." She left without another word, her injured wing brushing against a flowering vine as she passed. Yuki sat alone in the garden for a long time, her fingers moving automatically through the pattern she no longer needed to see. The ventilation hummed. The water dripped. She thought about patience, about the 9 years it had taken to reach this moment, about the thousands of small choices that had accumulated into something that might finally matter. She thought about Thomas. He had been caught 8 years ago, in London, broadcasting unauthorized cultural transmissions to the outer colonies. The Council's security forces had not been gentle. They had damaged his vocal cords permanently, a punishment designed to fit the crime, to silence the silencer. Yuki had visited him once, in the detention facility, before his transfer to a work camp she could not locate. He had been 50 then, though he looked older, his hair gray, his hands trembling as he wrote notes on a slate because he could no longer speak. She had asked him why he had done it. Why he had risked everything for music, for stories, for the simple transmission of human voices across empty space. He had written his answer slowly, each letter formed with painful precision, asterisk because silence is not peace. It is erasure wearing a polite mask, asterisk. Yuki had carried that note for 8 years. She carried it now, in the same pocket as the sorry's list, as her grandmother's pattern, as the geometric waveform that would soon become the most important thing she had ever made. Julian found her again in year 7. He had changed. The angry young man who had demanded loud protest had become someone who understood the value of quiet preparation. He had orchestrated the deployment of cultural materials across 17 worlds, working through networks Nadia had established, using methods Elias had developed for bypassing media node security. He no longer shouted. He whispered, and his whispers reached further than any scream. "We're ready," he said. "The archive is complete. Every piece of council corruption we could find. Bribes. Suppression orders. The Kalari famine that was manufactured to force their compliance. The Palori plague that was allowed to spread because their silence was more valuable than their survival. All of it hidden in the audio files. Compressed, encrypted, distributed across the network. When the trigger broadcasts, it will flood every channel simultaneously. They won't be able to stop it without shutting down their entire infrastructure." Yuki nodded. She was knitting the final row of her pattern. The needles moved with a speed that suggested practice measured in decades rather than years. "And the operatives? Elias is embedded in the primary media node. He bypassed the silencing protocol 6 months ago. Nadia has the Draymari lower class ready to amplify anything that reaches them. They have their own distribution networks now, independent of council control." Julian paused. "And Thomas?" Yuki's needles stopped. She looked out the window, where the stars turned slowly in their ancient patterns. "Thomas is the reason we started. He'll be the reason we finish." She did not explain further. Julian did not ask. He had learned, over 7 years, that Yuki's silences contained more information than most people's speeches. In year 8, the whisper began. It started on Draymari industrial worlds, where workers in particulate-dulled factories hummed human melodies during shifts, where supervisors found contraband audio files hidden in equipment manuals, where teenagers traded forbidden recordings with the desperation of addicts. The council's censorship grid, designed to detect and block human signals, had been built to recognize digital perfection. It could not identify the analog warmth of vinyl recordings, the deliberate imperfection of live performance, the cultural weight of something that had never been edited. Nadia reported that the Draymari lower class had begun singing. Not well. Not in tune. They sang with the halting uncertainty of people learning a language that had been forbidden to them, their crystalline throats producing sounds that their aristocratic superiors could not comprehend. The songs were human. Folk melodies. Protest anthems. Lullabies. A factory worker named Voss, the same Voss who had traded 3 weeks' wages for a child's violin lesson, organized the first public performance in a warehouse on the edge of the industrial district. 300 Draymari attended. They sang together, their imperfect voices creating harmonies no digital processor would have approved. The council's security forces arrived too late. The performance had ended. But the recording, made on obsolete analog equipment that the censorship grid could not detect, spread through the lower-class networks within hours. By year 9, the flood had become unstoppable. Yuki received the final confirmation from Elias on a Tuesday. She was drinking tea, black, the same variety she had chosen for the preliminary hearing 9 years earlier. The irony did not escape her. She set down her cup, noted that it had gone cold, and opened the encrypted message. Asterisk all nodes ready. Broadcast frequency confirmed. Trigger awaits your signal, asterisk. She did not respond immediately. She walked to her record player, removed the Goldberg variations from its sleeve, and examined the surface in the dim light of her quarters. The warp was visible, a slight deviation in the concentric ridges that had developed over years of play. She had never replaced the record. She had never sought a cleaner copy. The warp was part of the message, part of the imperfection that made the signal authentic. She placed the record on the turntable. She set the needle in the groove. She sat in her chair, her knitting needles in her lap, and listened to the opening aria fill the small room. The piano notes emerged, spaced with that particular hesitation that Kalin would later find so disturbing. The imperfections were there. The scratches. The ambient noise. The warp that made certain notes wobble. And beneath them, encoded in the microgroove deviations that Yuki had memorized through years of knitting, the cryptographic key that would unlock the council's secrets. She sat motionless for 9 seconds. The music continued. She thought of Thomas, humming Bach through ruined vocal cords in a detention cell. She thought of Thessari, waiting 40 years for someone to remember the frequency. She thought of her grandmother's hands, showing her the basic stitch, saying the pattern holds even when you can't see it yet. Then she touched her console. The needle found its groove. Kalin stood motionless in his private chamber, the warped record turning on his console, the piano notes occupying space he had designated as exclusively his. 9 seconds of stillness. He had not experienced stillness in 60 years of political maneuvering. The Draymari aristocracy valued motion, decision, the constant crystalline growth that signified ambition. To stand motionless was to admit uncertainty. To stand motionless while human music played on his private frequency was to admit something worse. He touched his console. The encryption readouts confirmed what his auditory sensors already knew. The signal was not bypassing his security. It was not hacking his frequency. It was emanating from within the council's own infrastructure, using protocols he had approved, channels he had monitored, systems he had believed controlled. The music was not an invasion. It was a revelation of how thoroughly his own house had been occupied. The piano paused. Kalin's facets caught the emergency lighting, blue and fractured, and in the silence that followed he heard something else beneath the music. A whisper. Data. Information flowing through the same channel, compressed into the audio file's imperfections, decoded now by his own console's attempt to analyze the signal. He saw names. Dates. Transactions. The Kalari famine that had been manufactured to force compliance. The Palori plague that had been allowed to spread because silence was more valuable than survival. His own signature on suppression orders he had convinced himself were necessary. The music resumed. A variation this time, faster, the piano's rhythm building towards something Kalin did not have the musical vocabulary to name. But he understood acceleration. He understood momentum. He understood that somewhere in the station, in the city, on the worlds he controlled, other Draymari were hearing this same signal on their own private frequencies, their own supposedly inviolate channels, and that the lower class he had ignored for decades was already singing. Voss stood in the warehouse where 300 Draymari had first sung together, and he watched the broadcast fill every screen, every speaker, every frequency the council had not thought to protect because they had believed their own people too loyal, too dull, too crystalline to rebel. The human music played, and beneath it the council's secrets unfolded in text and image and recorded confession. Voss did not read quickly. None of the factory workers did. But they recognized names. They recognized dates. They recognized the particulate that dulled their facets, listed as a necessary atmospheric adjustment in documents that described their shortened lifespans as acceptable losses. Someone began to sing. Voss did not know the melody. It was human, he thought, though it had changed in the singing, adapted to crystalline throats and Draymari harmonic preferences. Others joined. Not well. Not in tune. The imperfections that the Council's editing systems would have eliminated. The imperfections that made it real. In Cairo, Nadia watched the Draymari lower-class networks light up with signals the censorship grid could not identify, analog warmth spreading through digital infrastructure like blood through veins. She thought of Yuki, 9 years earlier, choosing black tea in the observation deck kitchenette, her hands shaking slightly as she set the kettle to boil. She thought of Thomas, humming Bach through ruined vocal cords in a detention cell she had never been able to locate. She opened a channel to Elias. "It's working," she said. Elias did not respond immediately. He was embedded in the primary media node, surrounded by equipment he had spent 11 years learning to love and subvert, and he was watching the flood spread in real time. The human music files, distributed across 17 worlds, each one carrying its payload of Council secrets, each one exploiting the censorship grid's inability to recognize analog imperfection as signal. He had bypassed the silencing protocol 6 months ago, but he had not understood until this moment how complete the bypass would become. "The aristocracy is trying to shut it down," he said finally. "They're issuing kill commands. But the files are already in the lower-class networks. They're singing them, Nadia. The Draymari are singing the corruption into memory. Even if we shut down every transmitter, they know now." "How long?" "Forever." Elias laughed, a sound that surprised him. "Or until they kill everyone who heard it. Which would be most of the Draymari population under 30. Yuki sat in her quarters, the record still turning, the aria repeating now because she had set the player to loop, and she listened to the footsteps in the corridor outside. Security forces, probably. The Council would have traced the broadcast by now. They would know where it originated. They would know who had spent 9 years preparing for this moment, who had knitted cryptographic keys into muscle memory, who had chosen black tea in a kitchenette while planning the end of their silence. She did not move to lock the door. She did not move to destroy evidence. She sat with her knitting needles in her lap, the geometric pattern complete now, the waveform of the opening bars rendered in yarn and tension, and she waited. The footsteps stopped outside her door. A pause. Then a knock, soft, almost tentative. Yuki set down her needles. She crossed to the door and opened it. Thessari stood in the corridor, her injured wing held slightly askew, her feathers rippling with what Yuki had learned to recognize as agitation. Behind her, in the shadows of the emergency lighting, stood figures Yuki did not immediately identify. Palori. Kalari. Vorath. Species she had spent her adult life trying to understand, now gathered in a corridor that smelled of ozone and recycled air, their faces and facets and feathers turned toward her with expressions she had no linguistic framework to interpret. "The Council has called an emergency session," Thessari said. "They are demanding your arrest. But the open assembly has already formed." She produced a physical document, paper, another deliberate anachronism, and pressed it into Yuki's hands. The transparency clause. Absolute prohibition against suppressing native frequencies. 8,012 names. We have been collecting them for 40 years, waiting for someone to provide the language. Yuki unfolded the document. The names filled pages, handwritten in dozens of scripts, some she recognized, others she did not. Near the bottom, in a handwriting formed with painful precision, she found a name she knew. Thomas. London. Detained 8 years ago for unauthorized broadcasting. He had survived. He had been found. His name, written in a detention cell or a work camp or a hospital ward, had traveled across light years to reach this corridor, this moment, this document that would abolish the silence that had damaged his vocal cords. Yuki's hands trembled. She had not trembled during the preliminary hearing. She had not trembled during 9 years of preparation. She trembled now, holding paper that smelled of other worlds, other struggles, other silences finally ended. 35 minutes, Thessari said. That is how long it takes to read the names aloud. The council session begins in 40. We want you there when we present this. We want them to see who taught us to remember our frequencies. Yuki looked at her knitting needles, still on the chair where she had left them. She looked at the record, still turning on her player, the aria repeating its imperfect, unedited, authentic loop. She thought about the tea in her kitchenette, cold now, the same pot she had abandoned 9 years earlier. She thought about patience, about the pattern holding even when you cannot see it yet. I need to bring something, she said. She did not explain. Thessari did not ask. The Palori diplomat simply stepped aside, making room in the corridor for Yuki to gather what she needed. The council chamber was smaller than Yuki remembered. Or perhaps she was larger. She had been a junior linguist during the preliminary hearing, assigned to observe, to translate, to serve tea. Now she walked through the same doors as a representative of the Open Assembly, the document with 8,012 names carried in both hands because it was too heavy for one, her knitting needles tucked into her jacket pocket because she did not know where else to put them, the record because she could not leave it behind. The Draymari delegation sat in their crystalline tiers, their facets catching the chamber lighting in patterns that suggested fracture. Kalen was not among them. Yuki learned later that he had resigned during the emergency session's opening minutes, that he had returned to his private chamber and destroyed his console and sat motionless while the music continued to play on frequencies he no longer controlled. But in the chamber, his absence was a presence, a space where authority had been and was no longer. Julian stood near the observation windows, his posture changed from the angry young man who had demanded loud protest. He nodded when Yuki caught his eye. Nadia was there, and Elias, their cover identities abandoned, their 11 and 5 years of embedded service concluded. They did not smile. They had learned, as Yuki had, that victory in these matters was not celebration. It was simply the absence of silence. Thessari read the names. 35 minutes. Yuki listened to each one, the syllables strange and familiar, the accumulated weight of 40 years of suppressed voices finally given frequency. When Thessari reached Thomas, she paused. She looked at Yuki. Yuki looked at the document, at the handwriting she had recognized, and she felt something shift in her chest, a tension releasing that she had not known she carried. The council voted. The edict was rescinded. The silence was ended. Not with a shout. Not with violence. With a list of names read aloud, with a warped record playing on a loop, with knitting needles in a jacket pocket that had become, through 9 years of patient translation, the key to everything. Yuki returned to her quarters alone. The corridor was empty now, the emergency lighting returned to normal, the ozone smell fading into the station's usual recycled atmosphere. She set the document on her desk, the 8,012 names still heavy in her hands, and she placed the record back on her player. The aria emerged, imperfect, wobbling, authentic. She sat in her chair. She removed the knitting needles from her pocket. The geometric pattern was complete, the waveform rendered in yarn, the cryptographic key no longer needed because the locks had been opened. She could have thrown it away. She could have burned it, unraveled it, reduced 9 years of memory to loose thread. Instead, she began to knit something new. Not a pattern she had memorized. Not a code. Simply a shape that felt right in her hands, the rhythm of the needles clicking against each other in time with the music. She did not know what it would become. She did not need to know. The pattern would hold even when she could not see it yet. Outside her window, the station turned slowly against the starfield. Somewhere, she knew, Voss was singing in a warehouse. Somewhere, Thomas was humming Bach through vocal cords that would never fully heal, but that could finally be heard. Somewhere, Kalen sat motionless in a ruined chamber, listening to music he could not stop, understanding something about imperfection that his crystalline perfection had never allowed. Yuki knitted. The record turned. The stars burned in their ancient, indifferent patterns, and for the first time in 9 years, the silence between the notes felt like peace rather than preparation.